I'll be speaking to Barbara Wien, who has just returned from a trip to Ukraine as part of an interfaith emergency delegation. Barbara is a professor at American University and works at establishing nonviolent programs as a response to war. She'll be speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Stanley. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Could I start with what might have been the most emotionally striking part of your visit to Ukraine? Could you describe that to us?
Yes, and excuse me if I become emotional. Our first visit was Babyn Yar, which is the Holocaust Memorial in Kyiv, Ukraine, where 33,000 Jews and others were systematically mowed down, gunned down, and dumped into a ravine by the Nazis during World War II. We started our first press conference there, and the Vatican had a representative with us, and we were almost a 20-person delegation made up of imams from throughout Europe, Spain, Italy, Poland. We also had numerous rabbis with us on the trip and bishops. And I can give you the details of all of these noble interfaith leaders and archbishops and others and representatives from the Vatican. The delegation itself, the caliber of these world-class theologians was just stellar. And I felt so honored to be in their company. So we prayed together at Babyn Yar. We went on a privatized tour there. We saw the massacre site and the ravine where 33,000 Jews were dumped. And it was particularly personal for me because my father fled the Holocaust in Poland and through the kindness of strangers was saved and escaped thanks to the efforts of a young U.S. Foreign Service officer. And my father fled with his mother and sister via the Trans-Siberian Railroad through the USSR, China, ended up in Hong Kong, and took a steamship to Seattle in 1939. But all of the rest of our relatives were wiped out in the Holocaust. We lost everyone. Babyn Yar is the most amazing sight. People have got to go. The Ukrainians have done so much to honor the dead, and I don't know if there's time for me to explain what they've done.
Yes, please do.
Well, after the war was over, the Soviets were highly insensitive to what had happened there to the Jewish population, basically just dumped the bodies indiscriminately. There were no markings. They paved over many of the areas where Jews had been buried, amusement parks and various facilities. But when the Ukrainians gained independence from the USSR 30 years ago, they began to resurrect the memory of these wonderful Ukrainian people, and they honored them by reburying them with headstones, marking the graves of the victims of the Nazi Holocaust at that point. And they have created a giant wooden structure that looks like a closed book. And then through a series of pulleys, it opens to become the most remarkable synagogue with hand-painted frescoes all on the inside. I'll send you pictures of those for your viewing audience. And there they honor the war dead right above the ravine where the Jews were dumped. And they've also created graveyards and pathways that light up at night saying the names of those who perished. Many, many things at Babyn Yar to honor the dead, and not just Jews, but others who perished at the hands of the Nazis. So they've really done a lot to upgrade and improve Babyn Yar over the years. It is just a remarkable site, and so very valuable for people to learn what had happened and to honor those who died.
And this is in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine?
Right on. Yes. Yes. That's in Kyiv. Yes. It's pronounced Kyiv or Kiev in the United States.
Now let's go back to the beginning, really. How, when did you go to Ukraine, and why?
We were invited by the mayor of Kyiv and the top religious leaders in Ukraine to honor the peace tradition of the world's religions, all the world's religions, the golden rule, treat unto others as you wish to be treated yourself, and the peace traditions of all the world's great religions. And those of us who had heard about the call in the United States attempted to begin networking. And I want to give a huge shout out to Pax Christi, which is a Catholic social justice network, and Sojourners, headquartered in Washington, but with representatives all over the United States. They put out a fabulous magazine. Many of you who may have recognized Jim Wallace over the years, huge social justice advocate. Our representative was Rose Berger, who is a brilliant theologian and scholar and journalist. They began networking in the United States, inviting us, and through happenstance and serendipity, they interacted and networked with a wonderful Polish organization, Patient, a European association. And we began building the delegation at the request of the Ukrainians. We were dispatched our US representatives on the 22nd of May, arriving in Warsaw, where we met our counterparts from throughout Europe and Poland. And we then journeyed by 15 hours on bus over the Polish border to Kyiv, where we were greeted so warmly by Ukrainians with grace and dignity, those who had been raped and bombed and brutalized. And they welcomed us and met with us, and we began to give press conferences and prayer services.
So you went directly to Kyiv, and
Yes.
and you know, just about 2 weeks ago, I mean, something like that. It's very recent. So you toured around Kyiv and you saw some damage there, I assume.
Yes, we did. We met with the deputy mayor of Kyiv because the mayor himself was in Davos at the World Economic Forum. I imagine, trying to get infrastructure investments for the future. But we met with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish religious leaders throughout our course of time in Kiev to learn their reactions to the present situation and to learn what they saw and witnessed. We went into bombed out churches with bullet holes in the walls where people had worshiped. They also hid. They hid in the basement of the churches while Russian soldiers patrolled above in an area called Irpin, IRPIN, on the outskirts of Kyiv. We visited Ukrainian Greek Catholic churches. We visited Russian Orthodox churches. We met with the top imams from both the Tatar Muslim tradition in Ukraine, who have been repeatedly displaced by the Soviet Union and now Russia in recent decades and over the generations. We also met with Arab Muslim faith traditions. They have both in Ukraine. And that's the big takeaway I want you to understand, and I want your viewing audience to understand, that Ukraine is a multi-faith, pluralistic democracy. They've been struggling with this for 30 years to establish themselves. And you have to remember, at one point they had Hitler on one side and Stalin on the other of their country, and have been besieged many times. And so they, are not without their flaws. They're not without their discrimination. Of course, I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture of Ukraine, but they have made many attempts to be a multi-faith, pluralistic democracy at great personal risk. And, in 2004, they had a nonviolent revolution called the Orange Revolution against Putin's and Russia's puppets. At that point, it was Yeltsin's puppets. No, it was Putin's puppets. And then again in 2014, they had the Maidan Revolution. Again, trying to purge corruption, trying to purge undemocratically elected leaders, and they succeeded. And so we met with many of these faith communities all around Kyiv, on the outskirts of Kyiv, and we met with civil society leaders as well, women's movements, peace movements, and mediation specialists who are trying to resolve conflicts in the home, in the community, because as we know, during times of war, interpersonal violence also increases, and things like domestic violence. So they're very honest about it, that they're trying to, through prayer and pastoral accompaniment and interfaith efforts and mediation and peace building, peacemaking, trying to address violence at all levels of society. We also delivered humanitarian aid. That's not our particular specialty. There's many large-scale macro networks that are doing that much better than much better than our delegation. But that's just a small flavor of all the different kinds of people we met with. And particularly meaningful for me was to meet with all the top rabbis in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
They were funny and warm and gracious and joked with us and just very wise. And I want to say later a vignette on our final night with 3 rabbis. And of course, when you have 3 rabbis at the table, you have to call the question, right? Because Jews do this. We debate and discuss and ponder the great issues of the day.
I wanted to go back a bit. You mentioned the Tatars, and I think people don't know about the Muslims of Ukraine. And as I understand it, they come from the Crimea.
That's right.
And you mentioned how they were dispossessed. Maybe just a little bit about how Stalin dispossessed them. Ethnic cleansing, is a more accurate word, I think, in the 40s.
That's exactly right. And there is a very vast history of them being dispossessed and relocated or fleeing. And that once again, they've had to flee. I mean, they showed us their beautiful child care centers, their beautiful nursery schools and kindergartens that they had built for the Muslim population in Ukraine. And all of the little cubbies were empty. All the little coats and shoes were still in their little childhood cubbies. And the Ukrainian Tatars had fled out of fear. There's generational trauma there. And those that remain are trying to keep the Muslim traditions alive in the mosques. But yes, Stalin was brutal against them, and so have subsequent Russian leaders. They've tried to convert them forcibly. And when Crimea was annexed in 2014, again, they faced ethnic cleansing. So the landscape and the picture of what has happened to them over many generations is appalling, and is not unlike the history of what has happened to the Jews. The Jewish community in Ukraine has been decimated. 84% of the Ukrainian Jews have fled. Again, they have that intergenerational trauma of what had happened both under Hitler and Stalin. And so
you're saying, let me be clear, 84% of the Jews have fled since the invasion in February.
Yes, exactly. What remains are the elderly and the poor, those who don't have the money to leave. Mm-hmm. So Rabbi John Markovitz and his wife Ina, who we met with, are feeding 2,000 people a week. And they're not just feeding the Jewish population that remain in the Kyiv area. They're also feeding people of other faiths, because that's what Ukrainians do.
Now let's get into the politics. A big charge of what is a large section of the US and international left is that what's going on in Ukraine is a proxy war, and that Ukrainians are only fighting because the US and its allies are manipulating them. What do you think of that description?
I think it's an insult to the Ukrainian people. I think it's an insult to the 2 nonviolent revolutions that they themselves has instituted. I think it's an insult to the 30 years of independence that they've been forging, independent of anything we did. These are proud people. These are resilient people. They are extremely innovative, entrepreneurial, and very, very strong. They have a very strong constitution. And what I saw there was a deep and abiding faith in their fellow Ukrainians. They were not looking to be rescued by the West, as Zelensky himself said. I don't need a ride out of my country. I need to be able to defend myself. I don't want a ride. I want weapons. So they are in the driver's seat on this. And the important thing to remember is that they are really trying to forge their own future and not take marching orders from anybody. And they've been doing this for a long time. And if you read the history of Ukraine, they know you can see they've been battered by many superpowers, but they've tried to maintain the course, that they can shape the course of human events themselves. And I feel that the parliaments, the minister of culture we met with, the ministers of education we met with, they're deeply appreciative of our solidarity, but they're not waiting for the script from us. They are in charge of their own destiny. And what I saw was a deep and abiding patriotism, which is very different from nationalism. Patriotism is the belief in values and principles and universal standards of rights. Nationalism requires you to have enemies, and we've seen the ugly face of nationalism, both in the United States and around the world with the rise of authoritarian dictatorships. This is not what I witnessed in Ukraine. What I witnessed in Ukraine was patriotism. The belief in their country, the belief in their people, the belief in a multi-faith, pluralistic democracy. That's what they're pursuing. And they don't be in the pockets of Putin.
Well, just to follow up on that, when the US government was in Vietnam in the 60s, the anti-war movement started pretty quickly here. Is there evidence of a movement within Ukraine calling for a halt of military resistance to the invasion?
Well, if I answer that question fully, I will put people at risk. I will put future delegations at risk because we do hope to send waves and waves of future delegations to stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people at their request. We are not just parachuting in, as some kind of a savior rescue mentality. We were invited to come. I think that those people that are trying to seek a just peace through alternative means to resolve this conflict could be at risk if I talk about their efforts. And yes, there are those that don't want to take up arms. There are conscientious objectors in Ukraine. They're very small, they're very marginalized, and they are being discredited because they can't bring themselves to kill. But you can understand in the midst of these bombardments and attacks, how people might see that as a betrayal of the war. They might label these people as traitors. We don't, as people of faith, label them as traitors. We believe in people's right to declare themselves conscientious objectors. But it could be perceived as undermining the war effort.
But do these people, again, this question of manipulation, I have to bring it up because so much of the US left believes it. Are these people saying, well, we won't kill, that's our principle? Or are they saying what we said during Vietnam, that the whole cause is nonsense and we shouldn't be fighting, we shouldn't be resisting?
No, they're coming from a deep and abiding belief in the sanctity of all life. And they were conscientious objectors way before Russia invaded. No, they're not critiquing the war per se, but they're saying other means have to be pursued as well. And, some of them believe in the sanctions. Some of them believe that negotiations have to be pursued. Some of them believe that pouring weapons into Ukraine is actually going to escalate and cause a much greater conflagration. So they're not monolithic in their views. And can I just step back and say, for the viewing audience who don't know, 500,000 young men refused to fight in Vietnam. 500,000 young men refused to fight in Vietnam. 4,000 of whom were imprisoned, many of whom went underground or assumed different identities, many of whom fled to Canada, but the rest of them came out fully and burned their draft cards because they believed we were not on the wrong side in Vietnam, we were the wrong side. And we were fighting, a national liberation movement. So we had a very robust anti-war movement. It took about 6 years to scale up, but that is very different from an invasion of your own country. So I think we need to distinguish the anti-war movement here during Vietnam and those that are under siege from Russian bombardment right now. Very different circumstances, but I'm very proud of the history of conscientious objection in the United States. And by the way, during World War I, we imprisoned conscientious objectors at Leavenworth. We stripped them naked and we hosed them down with freezing cold water in the hopes that they would die of pneumonia, and many of them did. And I highly recommend Steve Cohen's book called Jailed for Peace, which is the history of draft resistance from colonial times up until World War II.
Now, speaking of resistance, let's talk about Russia. Though you didn't travel to Russia, I understand you know a lot about the Russian anti-war movement. Could you inform us on that?
Well, the war is not popular in Russia. The unpopularity of this war is spreading. Russia has committed 138,000 troops into Ukraine, a third of which have died. So help me with my math. Is that about 45,000 Russian young, beautiful boys have died? Young men, some of whom have committed horrendous, unspeakable atrocities. I'm never going to excuse that. But my feeling is that Russian society may turn against this war in the next 6 months. We saw this with the Chechen wars. And on Victory Day, at the Victory Day parade, all the pundits and all the analysts around the world assumed that Putin was going to announce a mass mobilization of Russian society against Ukraine. He did not. He did not, and he has not scaled up a mass mobilization of Russian males in the country, because I think that people would quickly turn against that. Even in this massive disinformation media space in Russia, the word is getting out. And we've been testing anti-war messaging in Russia. And I can't really go into the details and the methodology of how that's being done, because again, it would put people at risk. But we're finding that the most effective anti-war message to break through the Russian propaganda is to say, they're coming for you next. The Russian military will be conscripting your son, husband, and brothers. And that gets people's attention. They seem to be sitting up and noticing that. Some of the other really promising trends and developments we've seen is #CallRussia. So the Russian diaspora around the world that are living outside Russian borders obtained 40 million Russian phone numbers off the internet. And they've been calling them since early March, trying to engage with Russians inside Russia to sow cognitive dissonance about the war and say you're actually not fighting Nazis in Ukraine, and they are trying to get out the truth about what's happening with Russian atrocities in the Donbass, in Luhansk, in other areas of Ukraine. And about 60% of the people hang up on them, don't want to engage out of fear or because they believe the propaganda. Another 20% begin to argue with the callers. And these are all Russian speakers, of course, native Russians calling Russians. But there's about 20% who have stayed on the line and said, yes, I'm against this war as well. And my son is over there, and can you help me find him? And Ukrainians have set up a hotline where they have identified the remains of Russian soldiers through forensics and DNA, and they've traced them to their social media posts. And the families have been calling the hotline in Ukraine, talking with these forensic scientists and others, and saying, how can you know that it's my son? And they said, well, we found their dog tag, we did facial recognition technology. And so we have bridges from Russian families to Ukrainians trying to help bury their loved ones or send their remains back to Russia, or at least let them know that they received a burial or where their sons, husbands, and brothers might be. There is the Mothers Soldiers Committee. This is a committee that was very effective during the Chechen War, literally going out on the battlefield, getting their sons out of the Russian tanks, bringing them back, trying to prevent the first Chechen War. And they also went into Russian prisons and revealed the horrible, inhumane conditions, which still exist today, of Russian soldiers who didn't want to fight in Chechnya. And unfortunately, I think they have not been as outspoken during this war because they're afraid of retribution or being rounded up, being arrested. We have about 15,000 dissidents in Russian prisons right now who spoke out against the war.
15,000.
Yeah, 15,000 dissidents are currently in Russian prisons. And these are intellectuals, artists, soldiers who refuse to fight, university students, some of whom smuggled cell phones in on their person when they were being detained at the police stations after being beaten to within an inch of their life and dragged into Russian police headquarters. They actually recorded their own beatings and broadcast it later on. So we are seeing scenes inside Russia of public opinion polls and surveys that they fear for their own sons, they fear for their own loved ones in Ukraine. There is, this huge reliance inside Russia by Putin for a narrative that resurrects World War II, that, the Ukrainians are now the Nazis. And we're fighting them, but it ends up undermining his own narrative, this reliance on the old World War II narrative, because when the truth starts to emerge, too many Russians have links and roots with Ukrainians, and 45,000 body bags or missing soldiers are going to begin to emerge, that this, and he's going to end up being discredited. Putin has prostituted the Immortal Regiment movement, which was the World War II soldiers. He's now discrediting that memory and dishonoring what happened in World War II. And people are going to be really upset when the truth comes out about this. Bodies are not being returned. Bodies are not being claimed. People are really, concerned and desperate to know about the war dead. And Putin just can't hide the truth forever. And particularly among the young people, they are not susceptible to his propaganda. I think you've probably read that many thousands of Russian young people have downloaded these virtual private networks to get around Putin's firewalls and blockades on the Russian media. Another whole wing of young people have fled and left. And some of them are living in Georgia with Georgians and Ukrainians who have left. They've actually got communal housing together. So these are young people who have been disenfranchised and invaded and dispossessed by Putin across 3 countries: Georgia, where Russia invaded in 2008, Ukrainian youth who feared for their lives and fled, and Russians are actually living together. There's many other trends that I could talk about in Russia of those who are trying to resist, erode Putin's pillars of power, and erode his claims about the war. And I don't know if we have time to go into all of those. I can send you some of those links as well. One of the earliest forms of resistance we saw were the cosmonauts. They left Russia in their blue Russian uniforms to go up to the International Space Station and join other astronauts from other countries. When they arrived, they were wearing Ukrainian colors. And we saw that as a subtle form of resistance, their form of resistance against the war. And of course, Putin couldn't arrest them up in space. I don't know what fate they will face when they return. The director of the Bolshoi has fled. The prima ballerina of the Bolshoi has left Russia. That people are voting with their feet against the war.
This has been fascinating, and I hope we'll hear more about it in the future. I want to thank you for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much. And I will send you links to our delegation. I will send you press releases and pictures. We've had over 45 major news articles about this interfaith emergency delegation to Ukraine in the European press, Polish press, Ukrainian press, Vatican news services, and others. So I appreciate you trying to raise the profile of the delegation in the US press.